Hello, my name is Lauren, and welcome to The End of the World. Brought to you by the Theoretical YouTube channel. That's right, because today we are covering a whole new batch of Jumba's genetic experiments to figure out which one is actually the most dangerous. So far, we've covered everything from civil disturbances and household pests to government secrets and elemental disasters. But with Series 6 comes a whole new threat level to contend with, because these are the experiments specifically designed to end the world. Well, most of them, at least. We have got a lot to discuss today, so let's just hop right in, because the end, my friends, is closer than you'd think. Okay, so here's the tricky thing about Series 6, because so far in the video series, we've talked about every experiment in numerical order. But so many of the experiments in this series are what I like to refer to as Stitch clones, not to be confused with the Dupe episode where Stitch is literally cloned. And there's a few other experiments that don't fit into that category, but I still want to lump together. So for the sake of organization and the fact that order really doesn't factor into the competition at all, we'll be shaking things up for this episode and starting with the poster child for the entire franchise, Experiment 626, aka Stitch. Obviously, if you didn't already know that, I'm really questioning how you ended up watching this video in the first place. But yes, Stitch was the experiment that finally got Jumba caught and captured by the Galactic Council over 600 monstrosities into his army.
Monstrosity! What you see before you is the first of a new species.
But exactly how powerful is Stitch? What are his powers, and how do they compare to the rest of his cousins? Well, the great thing about Stitch is that we see him in action all the time, which means that we get a pretty good overview of all his abilities. Starting with the fact that he is practically indestructible. I mean, in just the first movie, he survives being shot with plasma guns and run over by an 18-wheeler and shot out of a gas explosion in a volcano straight into outer space. Barely a scratch and ready to fight again. And throughout the TV series, the only times I can think of where Stitch was put out of action were because his bodily functions had already been compromised. Like when his mucus is drained and he goes into extreme dehydration, or when the cloning process depletes his essence. But normal everyday Stitch can pretty much always take the hits as they come. Over the course of the series, Stitch is also shown to have super hearing, speed, vision, and wall climbing abilities. He has the mind of a supercomputer and the reflexes to rival almost any other experiment in Jumba's lab. Not to mention his pre-programmed desire to seek out large cities and destroy infrastructure, which certainly makes him a threat to any and all civilizations. But by far, Stitch's greatest gift is his strength, which we see him using all over the franchise. According to both Hamsterville and Gantu, Stitch can lift up to 3,000 times his own weight and not an ounce more, which is exactly what we see in the episode Swirly. What's difficult about figuring out how strong this actually makes him is that it's not as simple as figuring out how much Stitch weighs and then multiplying it by 3,000. Because realistically, how much does he weigh? One of Stitch's unique attributes is that he is extraordinarily dense, which is why he can't float. So his weight is not necessarily comparable to other animals his size and shape. He is probably going to be heavier than a mid-sized dog. However, we also see other characters lift him on several occasions, including Lilo herself, who, might I remind you, does not have super strength and is only 6 years old. Therefore, Stitch cannot be absurdly heavy under Earth's gravitational effects, or at least so heavy that a 6-year-old couldn't restrain him. So, according to the CDC, the average weight of a 6-year-old is about 45 pounds or 20 kg, and depending on height and body type, that can range anywhere from 35 to 60 pounds. But Lilo never seems to be extremely tall or short compared to the rest of her peers, so we're probably still hitting that 45 benchmark. Assuming that she could, at maximum, lift up to half her own body weight, which even then seems like we might be stretching it, that would put Stitch's weight on Earth at 22.5 pounds, or 23 pounds, because we're making up numbers semi-arbitrarily, and I see no reason not to round now. 23 multiplied by 3,000 means that Stitch could lift up to 69,000 pounds, or 31,297 kilograms of weight on Earth. Which is a lot. Remember that Volkswagen Beetle he lifted in the first movie? Well, those only weigh a little over 3,000 pounds, which means that Stitch could conceivably and easily lift over 20 of them above his head at once. And according to weightofstuff.com, that's equivalent to 1 train car or 7 hippopotamuses. So yeah, Stitch, incredibly dangerous. Not only is he absurdly strong, but he's also smart and fast and extremely skilled in hand-to-hand combat, which is not an inherent skill, nor one that all of Jumba's experiments possess, which is presumably why Stitch can subdue so many of them himself. So the real question of this episode becomes not which experiments in Series 6 are dangerous, but which ones happen to be more dangerous than number 626. So what better place to start than with the slew of experiments who all claim to have all the powers of Stitch, but with some sort of twist. Like number 625, aka Reuben. Reuben has all the powers of Stitch, but none of the motivation, which is an endless frustration for Gantu, who just can't appreciate a good sandwich. Now there's an argument to be made here that because Reuben is said to have all the powers of Stitch, he should be classified as at least as dangerous as Stitch, but I just don't think he is. For one thing, Reuben was never as evil as Stitch. Like, right out of the pod, 625 was never in that same apocalyptic feral mindset. Which is weird to say because he spends most of the franchise working for the bad guys, but Reuben just never really needs to be reconditioned the way that all of the other experiments do.
Ham or tuna?
And like I said before, Stitch's combat skills are not inherent to his genetics. They are learned and practiced. So even in a one-on-one fight where Reuben mustered up all of the motivation to give it his all, I still don't think that he would have a chance of beating Stitch. Next up, we're hopping all the way back to number 600, aka Whoops, who was an early prototype of what would eventually become Stitch's design. Which is to say that he has some of the powers of Stitch, but is ultimately too clumsy to be able to use them effectively. Could he be considered dangerous as a loose cannon? Sure, but as dangerous as a well-oiled war machine? Not likely. Then we have experiment number 627, aka nothing. He never got a name in the series. 627 has all the powers of Stitch, but without the aversion to water, and unable to be turned to the side of good. You see, for all of Stitch's strength, he does have one notable weakness to water, mostly a phobia, because he cannot swim. It's not a Wicked Witch of the West melting situation, he's just so dense that he cannot float.
Why will he risk drowning?
627, however, does not have this weakness, making him more difficult to stop, therefore making him more dangerous? Right? Well, in his episode of the TV series, we also discovered that 627 has a different crippling weakness that Stitch does not. The habit of being immobilized by laughter. And he just so happens to find simple things like the bodily pain of others so amusing that he is very easily subdued by his own attacks. Which is something far more likely to happen in a combat scenario than falling into a swimming pool. Number 629, because 628's experiment pod was never actually activated, so I cannot possibly judge what its potential powers might be, is Leroy. Leroy has, say it with me now, all the powers of Stitch, but is just a little bit stronger. Meaning that in a one-on-one fight, Leroy actually does have a slight edge over Stitch and any other experiment whose primary power is strength. And I don't think it's actually said whether or not Leroy is as dense as Stitch and should therefore have the same aversion to water. But Leroy's big built-in weakness is that Jumba deliberately put a failsafe in him that would shut him down and immediately defeat any being with his genetic code. Which is convenient considering that Hamsterville's big plan was to build a clone army for the final act. Basically, you just want to sing the song Aloha Oi and then you've immediately won the fight, which is not the first time that this song has been the solution.
Aloha Oi, Aloha Oi. Aloha Oi, Aloha Oi. I am not beach ball like, I am hamster like.
2 nickels, weird it happened twice, wrong Disney animated cartoon reference. My point is that Leroy, much like 627, is easier to defeat than Stitch because their weaknesses are immobilizing rather than just an aversion to a substance, which Stitch even overcomes multiple times for different reasons. Which just leads me to an experiment who really looks like she'd be one of our Stitch clones, but whose powers actually have nothing to do with his. Experiment 624, aka Angel. Also known as all the pink Stitch merch that you've seen around downtown Disney. Angel has the power of seduction, meaning that she's able to flip Jumba's experiments from good to evil and vice versa through a sort of siren song.
No! You'll turn them back to good!
But her song doesn't appear to work on experiments created after her, aka Reuben, Stitch, 627, and Leroy. She also turns Jumba evil again, but since we don't see her song working on any other non-experiments, maybe Jumba just counts as one of his own creations? Was Jumba experimenting on himself? Is this a theory for another day? Anyway, within the context of the show, Angel is extremely dangerous because the island of Kauai is currently filled with hundreds of rehabilitated genetic experiments all working minimum wage jobs. And all she has to do is sing to reprogram them back into killing machines ready to wreak havoc on an unsuspecting population. Who knew that the mysteriously mute hairdresser with knives for hands was potentially deadly? How could we have foreseen this? However, outside of the show, Angel is kind of a worthless experiment if she is your only weapon. Think about it, the only time the Angel is actually dangerous is when you are fighting an opponent who just happens to have Jumba's genetic experiments who have already gone through a rehabilitation process without you. Because if they were already evil, then turning them good is not going to make them more of a threat to society. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that Angel is not all that useful in isolation.
I guess I was wrong. Love can't overcome everything.
Okay, so those are the Stitch clones, but before we dive into the rest of this episode, we need to talk about 3 Series 6 experiments who I have been dreading for a while. The ones who are the stuff of certified doomsday legend, who spell maybe not just the end of the world, but perhaps the whole universe. We need to talk about Holio, Launch, and Elfine. We're grouping these guys together into a category I'm calling the Cosmic Event Experiments because their power sets have the potential to be bigger than any earthly scale. One creates massive black holes, one promises to collapse the universe, and one is supposed to implode the universe. Because apparently it wasn't already collapsed enough to Jumba's liking. But, and here's where you're gonna get a genuinely hot take here, I don't think that these 3 should even be in the running for our competition. Because obviously the end of the universe, whether it's imploded, collapsed, or sucked into itself, or whatever, is going to be the most dangerous experiment. And in the context of this video series, that's such a boring anticlimactic ending after meticulously going through so many other contenders. Remember when we were looking at the one who takes unflattering photos? Those used to be our stakes. Besides, these guys are so dangerous that 2 of them are only ever mentioned and not actually shown on screen. Because if they actually were activated, that would mean an immediate end to the franchise. Like, whoops, sorry. You can't have wacky hijinks when all known matter is trapped in a singularity where the center of your universe used to be. And to think we were worried about the gerbil tyrant. So from this point on, we are going to talk about the Cosmic Event Experiments, but they won't be in contention to win. Because yeah, they win, hands down, the most dangerous experiments that Jumba ever created. Let's give the rest of them a fighting chance. Okay, so let's compare numbers 607 and 611, aka Launch and Elfine, who each give a twist on a similar fate. Launch is supposed to collapse the universe and Elfine would cause it to implode. But what's the difference? Well, when I pitched these two to my brother, he suggested that they might each represent different mathematical models that are trying to predict the way our universe will end. The Big Crunch and the Big Rip. Now we can think of each of these models as a sort of bookend or answer to the Big Bang. I feel like it's fairly common knowledge that many scientists believe that all known matter started out in a singularity that suddenly and rapidly began expanding, which is how the universe popped into existence and why it's still expanding now. I feel like we're on the same page here. Well, the Big Crunch is like a reverse Big Bang. Eventually, the universe will stop expanding and then contract back into a singularity. Yes, all of this is extremely simplified. Do you need a PhD in astrophysics in order to understand a Lilo and Stitch YouTube video? I mean, it's not like it would hurt. The Big Rip, however, is a model that suggests that instead of imploding, the universe will never stop expanding. Actually, it suggests that the rate of expansion will continue to approach infinity until atoms themselves are ripped apart faster than the speed of light, destroying literally everything. Do we know which mathematical model is truly correct and how the universe will end billions of years from when we're gone? Nope. Anyway, using the language from the TV show, I'd say it's more likely that Elfine's implosion is more like the crunch, and Launch's collapsing is maybe the Big Rip. But either way, the dangerousness level remains the same. Unfathomably fatal for any unlucky life form who happens to find themselves still around. You know, probably one lone tardigrade who was cursed with immortality by a sacred axolotl or something. Neither Launch nor Elfine actually appear on screen for obvious reasons, and Elfine even requires a passcode to activate that Jumba has forgotten. And apparently, Launch looks exactly like a naked mole rat, but with some spines. However, one of our cosmic events actually does appear on screen in an early episode of the first season, Experiment 606, aka Holio. But while the ability to turn into a black hole at will does seem like it might trump other contenders even in this Doomsday series, I'm here to tell you that Holio was actually out of the running for two reasons. If it was actually making black holes, it would fall into that too dangerous it's not even fun category. It doesn't actually turn into a black hole, because when Holio does turn into a black hole, it's more like a powerful vortex instead. And even though Jumba tells us that this is what a black hole looks like, I'd argue that there's already a much more dangerous black hole in this universe, which he, Pleakley, and Stitch get sucked into at the end of the last film. Holio is like a baby black hole who chooses what to capture in its gravitational field based on plot convenience and not actual physics. However, we do have to admit that Holio is incredibly strong. Like, it lifts cars, palm trees, even a house. Now, we know that Stitch is strong enough to lift multiple cars at once, but he's probably not strong enough to deal with a whole house. Since, and based on our calculations earlier before, your average house tends to weigh more than 70,000 pounds. And we know from our last video that palm trees are incredibly hard to knock down, so I would also imagine that they're difficult to uproot directly into the air. So therefore, Holio is likely stronger than Stitch, which also makes it one of the strongest experiments of all time. Not quite the black hole that was described, but I'll allow it to move on as a Nearthly sky vortex instead. Besides, at least this one was activated on screen. And finally, we have gotten through all of these special cases, so we can discuss the rest of Series 6. Starting back up with number 601, aka Kix. Kix is cool because he's actually one of the only experiments who has defeated Stitch in combat purely based on skill and not extraordinary circumstances. Which might suggest that Kix is more powerful than Stitch, but that would be misleading. Kix's pre-programmed power is combat skills, meaning that he has a natural ability to fight in addition to his somewhat superhuman strength. But he's not as insanely powerful as Stitch, he's just a more talented fighter. And Stitch actually does end up beating Kix through strategy and coaching, meaning that Kix is neither more powerful nor more dangerous than Stitch.
You did it, Stitch!
4 beefy arms may be better, but not strong enough to earn you a top spot. Number 602 is Sinker, who has the ability to sink any ship, which is terrifying. Like, just imagine you're minding your own business in a kayak and then you see this giant fin just beelining it for you, or a rowboat, or a sailboat, a yacht, a cruise ship. I mean, the implication here is that Sinker could sink a military-grade aircraft carrier just as easily as a paper boat. But like, how? He's not even swimming that fast, but he's shown to be able to cut through a variety of boat building materials like wood and metal. So is he just applying a ridiculous amount of force somehow? I mean, if he's not swimming that fast, that would mean that he'd have to be incredibly massive in order to apply that much force and brute force his way through these materials. But he's not that big, so that would mean that in order to be that heavy, he would have to be incredibly dense, which would mean that he'd run into the same problem as Stitch of not being able to swim, which is clearly not a problem. So all this would imply that Sinker's true ability is not strength, but how incredibly sharp his fin is. You see, sharpness is measured by the amount of force required to cut through an object, but a more sharp blade requires less force to be effective. If you've ever sharpened a knife before, you might be familiar with various tests, like shaving hair off of your arms or easily gliding through a piece of paper. A truly sharp edge doesn't catch as it cuts and only requires a little bit of force to get the job done. It should feel effortless. And while the common adage might be a dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one, that only applies when you yourself are the one wielding it. And when that blade is attached to the back of a sentient monster bent on mass destruction, yeah, I'd say that the sharper the blade, the more dangerous the experiment. And Sinker is definitely our sharpest knife in the drawer. Number 603 is Zap, or the living laser beam, which would imply that he's made of light, but that's clearly not the case given the way he looks and interacts with his environment. More likely he's made out of electricity, similar to Sparky from an earlier series. And let's face it, when it comes to electric-type Pokemon, I mean Jumba's totally original experiments that had no outside influence from pop culture whatsoever, yeah, Zap was never going to be the face of the franchise. Number 604 is Houdini, who can make things turn invisible. And the thing about Houdini is that Jumba actually considered him a failed experiment because he could not accomplish his pre-programmed task. Jumba designed 604 to be able to turn entire armies and weapons invisible so that they could not be traced on a battlefield. But Houdini ended up so cowardly and gun-shy that he'd never even be able to be used in a combat scenario because he'd be such a flight risk himself. On paper, Houdini would be a useful tool for stealth missions, but in practice, he's just good for cheap parlor tricks. So no, I'm not advancing him to the next round. Number 608 is Slugger, who can use his tail to hit balls with the force of a professional baseball player. And considering that according to MLB.com, the average baseball swing in the pro leagues is going to clock in at about 80 miles per hour, that's incredibly hard. I mean, I guess that's why you wear a helmet. Your standard pro bat is going to weigh 32 ounces or 2 pounds or almost a kilogram. Now, because of angular speed, the entire bat is not moving at the same velocity, but let's pretend we're in a non-AP physics lesson and just use the weight of the whole bat. The equation for kinetic energy, our old friend, is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. If all of the energy from Slugger's swing transferred directly into his target with an 80 mile per hour swing and a 2-pound tail, that ends up with about 580 joules of energy. For reference, that's roughly the same amount of energy as if we took a 10-pound bowling ball and dropped it off of a 4-story building. Not a pleasant experience to be clocked in the head with. With a single blow from Slugger, you're looking at concussions, brain damage, and possibly immediate death. However, while that might sound dangerous, it's not more dangerous than a real pro baseball player, of which there are hundreds just running amok in our society. I mean, sure, they can't fly, but that's not exactly Slugger's main deal, right? Number 609 is Heat, who's able to shoot a concentrated beam of heat from his forehead. It looks like a laser. Is it supposed to be a laser or fire? It's not really clear, but either way, what kind of damage are we looking at here? Well, he is able to cut cleanly through wood and barely through metal, which makes him actually less powerful than laser cutters we have out here in the real world. And if he's truly just using heat alone to do the job, then why doesn't the wood burn or the metal melt? Number 613 is Yarp, who causes temporary hearing loss through sonic blasts. Hearing loss from a sudden loud noise is 100% a real thing, hence all the movie sequences where the sound design is weird after a bomb goes off, called a low-pass filter. And repeated exposure to Yarp's temporary effects are more likely to make the victim's hearing loss more permanent. similar to how real people in loud professions have to manage and limit their exposure in order to prevent lasting damage. But how loud is YARP? Well, sound is measured in decibels, and according to the CDC, hearing loss after less than a 2-minute exposure begins at around 110 decibels, which is about the same as a dog barking directly in your ear. But more immediate hearing loss starts at around 150 dB, which is more similar to a close-range firecracker. Using these comparisons, that would mean that standing right next to YARP would be like listening to repeated explosions or having an emergency siren ring in your ears. However, if we look at the bigger picture here, hearing loss is a serious issue, but it's not the most dangerous threat that Jumba's ever created. This is a real concern that hundreds, if not thousands of workers already deal and manage with in loud working environments every day. And even if you do completely lose your hearing due to an exposure with YARP, there are still many ways for you to relearn how to navigate the world. Deafness is not the end of the world. I mean that literally. This is the Doomsday episode. Number 617 is Plasmoid, who shoots balls of plasma. And to be honest, Plasmoid really annoys me, because I don't think he's really shooting plasma. And even if he was shooting plasma, that doesn't actually help us figure out how hot his blasts would be or how much energy he could dish out. Because everything could theoretically be plasma, just like how everything can be a solid or a gas. The difference is not the substance, it's the amount of energy contained within the molecules. So the energy of a neon plasma blast is a lot less than the hypothetical iron plasma blast. We just don't know what is in Plasmoid's balls of plasma. Also, they don't do as much damage as you'd expect. Like, sure, they're shown to break through wood and glass, but I'd argue that's unclear whether it's due to their heat or velocity. And even so, he fails to destroy a lamp with a direct shot. And therefore, simply because he annoys me, I am not allowing Plasmoid the satisfaction of moving on. Except I have the exact same problem with our last experiment, number 619, aka Splody Head. You want to talk about inconsistent power levels? Well, the show itself can't even decide whether or not Splody Head is shooting fire or plasma. Because Jumba, the creator of all of these experiments, keeps using the term interchangeably. And then he even confirms the presence of plasma by licking the residue. So clearly the substance itself is not that dangerous. And the damage from any individual blast ranges from completely blowing up a raft to barely singeing the side of a cliff. But then fast forward to the second half of the season and suddenly Splody Head can go toe-to-toe with Slushy, our winner from the last episode? In fact, apparently Splody Head now has enough firepower to completely undo Slushy's blizzard and bring back the Hawaiian heat wave, which would require, at minimum, the same absurdly high amount of energy that Slushy initially absorbed in the first place, which was enough joules to easily beat out earthquakes and hurricane force winds. Except he barely beats Slushy, and most of the Ice Palace doesn't even melt. How are we supposed to correctly evaluate Splody Head when his power level seems to fluctuate to whatever the narrative needs him to be at any given point? It's infuriating! Okay, so for one thing, I don't think Splody Head is actually as powerful as Slushy. For instance, we don't know how long it took him to reheat the island. Part of the reason Slushy's freeze was so impressive is that it happened almost instantly. But even if Splody Head eventually resupplied the amount of energy that Slushy took out of the system, it is less impressive over a longer period of time. If you left a hairdryer on for eternity, you'd get astronomical results too. But second of all, I don't think that Splody Head is as powerful as Stitch. Jumba calls Splody Head's secretion weapons-grade plasma, just like what is loaded into the guns throughout the rest of the series. And we've seen Stitch take direct hits from these weapons before, meaning that he is likely capable of handling anything Splody Head could potentially dish out in one shot. So, while he did defeat the last series champion in a one-on-one fight, I am choosing to not advance Splody Head into the next round of competition. And my friends, at last, it is finally time to select a Series 6 winner. besides the two that already won the whole shebang. It comes down to Stitch representing our Stitch clones, Holio the Doomsday Device, and Sinker to round out the semi-finale. So let's start out with the obvious strengths. Stitch is one of the most well-rounded experiments due to his combination of being virtually indestructible and incredibly strong. His potential for damage is not only because he can unleash massive amounts of force and energy, but also because he's incredibly difficult to stop. On the other hand, Holio is also clearly strong, especially since he can lift heavier objects under the same gravitational conditions. Again, if you don't consider Holio an actual black hole. But on the massive fin in the middle of your two hands, Sinker can cut through almost any material, right? If it's part of a ship. But how far does that particular power extend? Like, could Sinker split an atom if it was somehow classified as a ship? If so, we'd be talking about nuclear fission and energy outputs unprecedented in the competition so far. Perhaps even apocalyptic results if Sinker was uncontained and able to perform this type of fission over and over again. And yet, each of these experiments also has some sort of weakness that prevents them from unleashing their full potential. Stitch has his molecular density, which makes it unable for him to swim. Holio was defeated when Lilo and friends journeyed inside of it with a container of antimatter, because the show loves sciencey words without consequences. And Sinker can't fly. Okay, let me explain that last one. Sinker is an aquatic-based experiment, which makes sense because he's designed to sink boats, and boats are typically found on water. But is water itself that common in the Galactic Federation of Planets? When the Grand Councilwoman is trying to stop Stitch's escape, she has to ask what the massive patch of blue on Earth is.
What is that?
Water. Most of the planet is covered in it.
Once she's told it's water, she deduces that this planet is inhospitable for a creature like Stitch. But my point is that traditional ships as we know them probably aren't so prevalent in a society where a huge patch of blue on a map is not immediately identified as water.
No.
However, you might be saying, don't spaceships technically count as ships? Wouldn't Sinker still be dangerous to those passengers? And I totally agree. I think that Sinker could sink spaceships, if he could get to them. But have you ever tried self-propelling yourself through the vacuum of space? Oh wait, you can't! In order to cut through a ship, Sinker needs to move through it. And if he can't propel himself through space, he can't attack a spaceship, which makes him useless on almost any other planet besides Earth. So what it comes down to is the fact that Holio has been defeated on screen, Sinker is useless unless he's swimming, and Stitch has put in the work to slowly overcome his aversion to water. Seems like a no-brainer, guys. Stitch is one of Jumbo's most versatile experiments. He's the best version of anyone who claims to have all the powers of Stitch, and he can outperform pretty much most of his other cousins. It's a pretty darn good thing that Lilo was able to rehabilitate him, because if Stitch hadn't landed on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I don't think San Francisco would have been the only thing he destroyed.
Wow, San Francisco.
Which means we finally have our complete lineup moving into the grand finale. Checker, Shoe, Melty, Swapper, Huggo, Slushy, and Stitch. But be sure to tune in for the next episode when we reevaluate the cream of the crop to determine who is the most dangerous experiment of them all. Except for Launch and Elfine, who are cheaters and will not be rewarded for their off-screen achievements. But that is all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and believe me, I know if you haven't. You can also follow us on Twitter at Theory_Central, because I will literally end the world if you don't. And consider supporting us on Patreon, like the incredible David W. and Alex Toquinto. And I cannot stress this enough, I will end the world if you don't. Give me that sweet, sweet $1 a month. I promise I'll split it with my brother. Mom. Anyway, this has been an incredible series of videos so far, and I am so excited to finish the journey with you all. So thanks for watching. Is it too late to add the Barbershop Quartet back in as a last-minute wild card? And I'll see you later.
Oh good, my dog found the chainsaw.
Lilo, don't hang.